Okay, well, should we get going? What do you think, Mirabelle? Are we ready, or do you want to give people a few more minutes to roll in?
Yeah, I think we should give them about 2 more minutes.
Okie doke. We're going to wait about another minute and then we'll get started. So thanks for joining us if you're already here. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and start doing an intro. And Mirabelle, is the recording running? I think it said it was, right? Okay.
Yes, it's running, yeah.
Great, thanks. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us on this Thursday evening. I'm Nicole Golden, the Executive Director of Texas Gun Sense. And we are, if you aren't familiar with our organization, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit, Texas-based organization that is dedicated to advocating for the prevention of gun violence and other gun tragedies in Texas through education, partnerships, and policy change. And as I'm sure you all know, because you're here, we just got off of, at the end of May, a very busy regular legislative session. I say regular because you probably know that the state is currently in a special legislative session. And that's one reason why one of our special guests, Representative Vikki Goodwin, is on the floor of the House right now doing some important property tax work. And so she'll be popping in for a short amount of time while she can, and we'll be sure to give her the stage for the small amount of time she'll have for us. But we have staff member from her office here to answer questions. And we have other guests here as well that I want to get a chance to introduce you to. I'm just going to do quick housekeeping before I do that, which is that everybody's muted. And I think the way that the Zoom's set up, you'll be staying muted. When you have questions, which we do have a QA portion later, you'll be putting those into the chat. And my staff member, Mirabelle, here is going to be helping to call those out so that we hopefully get most, if not all, of your questions answered during that portion after the panelists talk. So I'm going to go ahead and welcome you all again. Warm welcome. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your engagement in the issue of gun violence prevention and for wanting to hear about what happened during the legislative session and hopefully take away what you can do to continue to advocate in your own worlds and in your own communities for the critical issue of gun violence prevention in Texas. So I'm going to now introduce our speakers and panelists. We have, as I mentioned, somebody from Representative Goodwin's office, Tabby Aditi, is here. Tabby, if you want to say a quick hello.
Hello, I'm Representative Goodwin's Deputy Legislative Director, and I managed all of our public safety bills this session.
Thanks, Tabby. And then I'm going to introduce my friend Christina Delgado from Community Justice Action Fund.
If I can get myself unmuted. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Christina Delgado from Community Justice. I am the Southwest Advocacy Associate based in Santa Fe, Texas.
And we have Dr. Lauren Gambill, who I'm going to let introduce herself now.
Hi, I'm Lauren Gambill, and I am a hospital-based pediatrician based in Austin.
Great. Something I want to mention too about our guests is that Dr. Gambill is not only a pediatrician and an advocate, but she's a member of Texas Gun Sense's advisory board. So we're lucky to have her in that role and to be able to work together in many ways. And then Christina Delgado, who works at Community Justice, that organization is a really key and important partner of ours. They lead the efforts on the reduction of gun violence in Black and Brown communities across the country. And she's leading that Texas work. And that's a big priority for Texas Gun Sense. So we're glad to work with them both. All right. Well, thanks to my staff, Mirabelle, and we have our intern Shayna here, and maybe some of the other staff has tuned in as well for helping to set this up. We really want to give you all a chance to dig in a little bit to what happened during the legislative session. You know, what happened with gun safety bills? Where did they go? What were the opportunities? What were the challenges? And what are we looking toward in the future? So I'm going to go ahead and just and start throwing some questions out to the panelists. And then again, you'll have your opportunity to answer some questions, ask some questions later. Before I do that, I'm just going to give you a quick and brief rundown of Texas Gun Sense's work during the legislative session and what we took from it. We've been around for 10 years, and we've been a leading voice on the issue of gun safety. We've worked heavily at the Capitol for many years. We've formed a lot of relationships with lawmakers. We've had bills filed. We're regularly there all through session, testifying on bills and working with lawmakers and leading our coalition. The Texas Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence was launched in 2015. And everybody here who's a speaker on the panel has a role in that coalition. There's almost 20 organizations from across Texas, from a variety of groups: domestic violence advocates, doctors, mental health advocates, teachers and educators, and I won't be able to name them all, but we worked really hard this session together to really be a cohesive unit to try to coordinate, because this work is so hard, and we know we can't do it alone, and we know we can't do it in silos. There were about 300 gun safety bills filed, gun bills filed. Some of them were gun safety bills, some of them were more harmful pieces of legislation. We have the hard job of tracking all of those bills, which is quite a job, and just trying to get a grasp of what's even been filed, and what the implications of those bills are, and what the likelihood of passage is, and what our actions are going to be. So we were extremely busy, but the coalition was a great resource in being able to come together to coordinate those efforts. I know you probably know this if you followed along at all, which I'm sure you all did and are informed. There were some great bills filed this session. A lot of them came out of Representative Goodwin's office, which is one of the reasons we value our relationship with her so much. Bills that would close loopholes on background checks, to require a background check on all private transfers of firearms, something that we currently don't have in Texas. There were some bills filed that would strengthen safe gun storage education and safe gun storage measures. There were bills filed to raise the age of purchase to 21 for semi-automatic rifles like AR-15s, and you probably know that was probably the most high-profile piece of legislation this session, because had that legislation been in place before May 24th, 2022, the 19 children and 2 educators at Robb Elementary would be alive today. And we worked very, very hard to support the survivors in their advocacy for that bill. And we're proud of what we did, that we were able to get that bill advanced through a bipartisan committee vote. And we have every intention of continuing to plug ahead and supporting them until that bill becomes law. I'm giving you just kind of a smattering of some of the bills filed. There were so many others. There were also harmful pieces of legislation that we had to push back against. Bills that would expand guns into places they don't belong, like schools or courthouses, sensitive places as we call them. Bills that would just loosen requirements that would remove some local control in terms of gun safety. And so, we worked also very hard on defensive work, which is just part of what we do in this field, and what has to be done to be that voice of reason. So that's the briefest overview. I wonder, actually, Mirabelle, I'm going to ask you if you could grab the legislative report that's on our website and put it into the chat. if you haven't read that report, I would really urge you to do that. That's where we really give a strong, a good summary of what went on during the session and our efforts, and the huge outpouring of support that we got from advocates like you all, from people who made phone calls and sent emails to lawmakers. I think in just a few days we had, I want to say, 28,000 emails driven to advocate for the raise the age legislation. That's really, really significant. And we owe it to people like you who are watching tonight for making your voices heard. It's always important. And we celebrate every win in this work, small or big. And though that bill did not move out of committee to a full floor vote on the House floor, it's because of people like you that we were even able to get it as far as we did. That's my brief little intro that I wanted to say. I see Representative Goodwin here, and I don't want to take up any more time during her precious few minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and send it over to her. If Representative Goodwin, if you just do a brief hello, and then I'll ask you a few questions while you're here.
Hi, everyone. It's good to be here. Thanks, Nicole. We are on the floor right now debating the property tax relief bill. So I may have to step back in, but I'm so glad to be here and talk about some of the things that we did this session. Three of my top priorities as far as gun safety goes are closing background check loopholes. I think across the board, people agree that we should be doing strong background checks. And so I had a couple of bills, one that was pretty comprehensive, saying that anytime you transfer a gun from one person to another, unless they're immediate family, that has to go through a background check. Of course, that didn't get anywhere. I had a hearing, and then I had a much smaller background check bill that would have closed a loophole around the handgun licenses if they're revoked or suspended, making sure gun sellers are checking those licenses before they skip the background check. That one got out of committee, actually, with a lot of work. We did get a vote, and it moved out of committee, but just did not get a hearing on the floor. So there also was a straw purchase bill that was carried by a Republican. Chairman Guillen had that, and it got out of the House, but not out of the Senate. And then there was another bill by a Dallas police officer on banning block switches, which got out of the House, but not the Senate. Another one that I've worked on is a 3-day waiting period. I think it would help with suicide by gun, and just so that people don't go and buy a gun and impulse. So that, and then we worked on a protective order bill that would have set up a best practice throughout the state on extreme risk protective orders, but that didn't go anywhere either.
Representative Goodwin, thanks for that overview. I know people love to hear that, and we always appreciate the bills that you file and how hard you and your staff work on filing really good gun bills. If you have a minute, I'm gonna, and tell me, just give me the heads up when you have to go. I did have some questions for you, and I'd love to ask, I'm starting with, how has your personal experience with gun violence impacted your advocacy at the Capitol?
Absolutely. Well, as you know, my dad was shot and killed in our home in Dallas, and it was actually one of my brother's hunting rifles that was used. We had an intruder come in, find the rifle. So if it had been stored in a safe, my dad might still be here today. So my first session, I testified to that and helped Donna Howard with her bill for safe storage for the public service announcement. DPS did get $1 million in order to put that program together, and it's been continuing and growing. So I did notice going into an Academy store that they do have signage, just encouraging people to store their guns safely in a gun safe. I think I think we need to go further with that and make it mandatory at some point, particularly if families have children in the home. But every step that we take is important. And you know, I do this work, advocacy, just like so many of you all do, because of the personal impact and not wanting other people to have to go through the same tragedy.
We hear that story a lot from survivors of gun violence, and really appreciate your perspective and your experience. Representative Goodwin, you were a member of the Community Safety Committee that heard most of the gun bills that were heard this session. And so I want to ask you, what were some of the most significant discussions, memories that you witnessed or experienced during your time on that committee this session, including any key successes or challenges?
Well, definitely when the Uvalde families came and testified, it really was heartbreaking. It always is to hear that personal testimony of such a horrific incident. But I'm glad that they got a chance to have the hearing. I know that at the beginning of session, the chairman was actually questioning whether he would give that bill a hearing. And so with a lot of pressure, it did get a hearing, and then he didn't put it up for a vote. And again, it took a lot of pressure. But I think the families felt like at least they were heard in the committee. That type of testimony does make a difference. I know it seems like it doesn't because things don't move as quickly as we would like them to, but I do think that we moved the needle on gun safety issues this session. We have to keep at it. It's not something that is an easy change to make in our policy in Texas, but I think that with that personal testimony, families coming to the Capitol, and continuing to put the pressure on all the representatives. So one of the Republicans that sits near me is Sam Harless, and he talks about his grandkids. And I think that's what will make the difference is people saying, look, I want a community, I want a school, a grocery store that's safe for my grandkids to go to, or kids.
Mm-hmm. And as you know, but maybe not all our listeners know, Sam Harless was one of 2 Republicans on the Community Safety Committee who voted to move the raise the age legislation out of that Community Safety Committee. He and Justin Holland, which is really significant.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I don't think in prior sessions they would have done so. So I think, unfortunately, the tragedies that we've had here in the state have made a difference.
Mm-hmm. What future, Representative Goodwin, before you have to leave, I'd really love for you to shed some light for folks on what future opportunities do you see for the gun safety movement in Texas, and how can advocates, whether they work in an organization like ours or just people out there who care, what can they be doing and how can they support your work?
So for the future, I think continuing to work on closing the background check loophole, working on some of the bills that have gained some traction, continuing to come to the Capitol, calling their representatives around the state, calling the governor and lieutenant governor and speaker. Since the governor and lieutenant governor represent the full state, it doesn't matter where you live, you can call them and share your thoughts on gun safety legislation. And that really is important. I know sometimes it feels like it doesn't make a difference, but it absolutely does. And as far as helping me, we love having people come into my office and help us. You know, we will probably pursue very similar legislation next session, but the personal input from constituents sometimes shapes our legislation. Maybe we'll do something a little different next session based on input that we get. So we always love to hear from people and get them involved through our office too.
That's great. It sounds like I think one may want that people are hearing is that their voices matter and showing up does matter, even though it can feel really, it can sometimes be hard to see that.
Yeah, absolutely. It does. And I think I'm going to have to step on the floor, and I really appreciate you giving me some time to be on here tonight.
Thank you so much for taking time to step away. We really appreciate you.
All right. Take care.
Bye. Okay, great. Well, I'm glad we got Representative Goodwin for a little bit, and she really does do tremendous work. And so I'm going to start to pivot some questions over to our other panelists, starting with Dr. Gambill. I wanted to ask you, as a pediatrician and a mom, what motivated you to become an advocate for gun safety?
Well, it's a great question. I think, I'll start with as a pediatrician, although they're not mutually exclusive, but I think, firearm injury is the leading cause of death in kids. And it's totally preventable. So I see a lot of things when I take care of kids that are not preventable, types of cancers and all sorts of things that I don't have a lot of control over, or, no one has a lot of control over, but firearm injury is not one of those things that we have complete control over it. And to me, it feels like, my responsibility as a doctor to do everything that I can to address the leading cause of death in children. That just feels like a very natural thing for me to do. And there's things that I treat with medicine, and there's science and there's evidence of how we can prevent this, and we know some of those solutions. We know a lot of those solutions, but we need the policy support to really get those through. And so it just feels like my professional obligation in a lot of ways to move this work forward. As a mom, I think I probably don't have to explain that very much. I mean, I see firsthand how this is impacting our kids in our communities, both kind of primarily through direct gun violence and then secondarily through secondary trauma. My kids are hiding in their cubbies too during lockdown drills. And so, I think it's just something that I think about every single day as a parent. And so it feels like something that I don't feel like there's any choice in the matter, I think.
Mm-hmm. I can really appreciate what you said. Before I send some questions over to Christina, I also want to ask you, Dr. Gambill, can you talk a little bit, and you don't have to cover them all, but maybe some of the highlights of specific gun safety bills you testified in support of this legislative session, and what they would have accomplished and why it was so important for you and the medical organizations you work with to support those?
Yeah, I mean, I'll kind of just talk in general because I probably won't go through kind of all the bill numbers, but just in general, bills that decrease child access. So in different, whatever capacity we can do that in. And so different child access laws, because we know that decreasing access to kids and to adolescents makes a huge impact for kind of acts of violence, but also in suicide completion. And so hugely important as from a science evidence-based practice in pediatrics as incredibly preventative. Also background checks, the evidence is pretty compelling in that regard. So strengthening background checks was another kind of category of bills that we really focused on within pediatrics. And then of course, raise the age, right? You don't have to be a doctor to understand some of the implications of brain development, but as physicians, we certainly understand enough about the brain to feel pretty strongly about how potentially impacting or impactful raising the age laws could be. So those are probably the biggest area. Also, I would say we testified a little bit on some of the reporting bills regarding kind of certain mental health conditions and federal reporting just in that regard as well.
Mm-hmm. And there was a win.
There was, yeah. So the other thing that I think about in this is some of the bills that we testified felt kind of small in the scale of things. Like, they may not impact as many lives as some of these bigger things, but this is not a problem that has a single solution. And so every single one of those tiny wins, and I don't mean tiny in a actual tiny, because if it has the potential to save even one life, I mean, that life is beyond measure, right? That's a child, that's somebody's son or daughter, that's somebody's niece or nephew or cousin or friend or parent. And so every single one of these things is so incredibly important.
And I'll just call out for folks that may not know which win we were referring to. It was SB 728. I think I'm remembering that right. That was filed by a Republican in the Senate. There was also a House Republican who filed a companion bill, and it was Senator Huffman in the House and Senator Huffman in the Senate, Representative Leach in the House, and this bill passed. And it will close a loophole that had been found to this regarding reporting of mental health records when they're significant enough to warrant the prohibition of purchase and ownership of a firearm for the 16 to 18-year-old set of Texas youth. And that loophole is now closed, and it would bring, just bring us up to federal standards. And it was a win for gun safety this session. Yeah. I'm gonna send some questions over to you now, Christina. As a gun owner and someone directly affected by the Santa Fe school shooting, how has your personal experience influenced your perspective in your work on gun violence prevention advocacy?
Well, Santa Fe was kind of the last straw for me. I had been affected by gun violence in multiple capacities, from 5th grade, having a friend be shot in a drive-by shooting that was intended for his brother, losing friends to domestic violence by a firearm. But having to watch my children go through the unimaginable of losing friends in a school shooting that never should have happened in Texas. It was really infuriating for me to know that what is a common practice of gun owners in securing your firearm when it is not on your person was the very reason that my friends had to bury their children. It truly was disheartening. It was a bit mind-boggling because that's, like I said, a common practice that all of us law-abiding gun owners should practice, are instructed to practice. When you go through a LTC class, this is one of the #1 rules. And so it really did empower me to, continue speaking out about this, because it just doesn't make any sense. And especially after experiencing my first advocacy day in 2019, alongside my friend Rhonda Hart, who lost her daughter in our shooting. Her daughter was Kimberly Vaughn. And even more so, her being a veteran, an Army veteran, and to have these lawmakers completely dismiss everything that she was saying, it really was mind-boggling to me. And so going into, coming into this work, we know what the truth is. And it's really about making sure that, these lawmakers understand we are not ignorant to the truth. We know what we can do. We know that these things are preventable. And we know that nearly every single one of these pieces of legislation that was filed this session and in sessions prior are acceptable and supported by gun owners. So I do feel that it's very important that gun owning Texans and gun owning Americans join in this battle, because it is our voices that are being misrepresented, not only in the state of Texas, but across this nation.
Thanks. And I know, and the data support that. Like, I think we heard there's 80% of Texas gun owners are support background checks on all gun sales. And I think somewhere around that, it may be in the high 70s. You guys can call out a number if I'm wrong. Supported the raise the age legislation. So we're talking about.
I would even take that further.
Mm-hmm.
I would probably say about 98% of the people that I know that are gun owners support these measures, because it's measures that would not affect us, because we are those law-abiding gun owners.
Right. I have you mentioned that you have experience with a major school shooting, and so I also want to mention that I know you worked really closely with the Uvalde families this session, joined them at the Capitol many times. Talk a little bit about the impact that survivors had during the session and some of the experiences and takeaways that the survivors, particularly the ones you met from Uvalde, had.
I think that one of the main reasons that we were able to move House Bill 2744, which was our raise the age bill, past what it was only intended, what we were told, to just make it to print. And the main factor for it being able to move is the tenacity and the passion that these surviving families had in their advocacy, in going in and truly sharing their story, but then not asking permission, but demanding that there be some sort of change, because they know, we all know, that this could have been prevented. We also know that there was a 4-year gap of inaction, 4-year and 6-day gap, I will say, from May 18th, 2018, when we were standing outside of Santa Fe High School, to when those families were standing outside of Robb Elementary, in the same places that us Santa Fe families were standing. And that is one of the main factors as to why Uvalde ended up occurring. But not only that, what was so bold this session was that we had these families from Uvalde, we had families from Santa Fe backing up the Uvalde families, but we had so many advocates that were calling in, making phone calls, that were sending emails, and also showing up. There was nowhere for any of these representatives to run and hide. And that was the defining factor this session. That's how we were able to move 2744. Not only that, we were able to extend beyond just, in the preventative measures, but even in the capacity of allowing these families the dignity and respect to have information on how their loved ones passed. And it was not limited to the Santa Fe families, not limited to the Uvalde families. This is to any family member who loses a loved one horrifically and tragically in an act of violence. We were able to move that bill that was the second time to have it be filed. And it is a lot of work for survivors to come and share their story over and over again, because each and every time they have to speak, each and every time they give testimony, they are reliving the worst moments of their life. But I can tell you that they are so empowered by the amount of support that they have from advocates. All of you here who have joined us today, and all of those that will watch this at a different time, to know that they are supported by everyone, that they know that the work that they're doing it makes a difference. It matters, because it is trying to save another family, another community from having to know what the pain of losing a loved one is.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Christina. I've got a couple more questions to ask to you, Dr. Gambill. In your experience as an advocate, as a doctor in this space, what have you seen to be some of the most common misconceptions or barriers to implementing gun safety measures? And in particular, was there anything during the legislative session that you heard or witnessed that felt like, we have some work to do to correct some of those misconceptions?
I think, it's interesting. I've been working in this space and doing a lot of advocacy around firearm injury prevention for a decade. And I think in my day-to-day practice, kind of with patients and families, I think things have really shifted. I think 10 years ago, it was much harder to have conversations with families in a way that felt natural and like a mutual partnership. It felt like something that was kind of taboo to talk about. And I think that, that has dramatically shifted. I think that the maybe thought or sentiment was sort of 10 years ago was maybe, this is a horrible thing, but it's not something that happens to me or my family. And I think, unfortunately, families, people, everyone kind of understands that this is something that could happen to my family, to my loved one, to my child. And so I think the conversations around safe gun storage and, the risk of having a firearm in the home and what that means for an adolescent, what that means for somebody that, a teenager with impulsive decision making, as all teenagers have. I think that conversation is really different, and I think that has really shifted in a powerful way. But it's not enough. It's not enough for kind of families to understand that, and we need the policy to support it. I would say one maybe kind of persisting misconception or barrier or conversation that I think we need to shine light on is, I think we think a lot about mass shootings. We think a lot about large violent episodes or large violent acts, massacres, these horrible, horrible things. And obviously these are so important, but I see far, far, far more children impacted by suicide completion than I do day to day in mass shootings. I want to stop both completely. But I think that is such a important conversation, and it's still a little taboo in a lot of ways. And I think we need to keep talking about it, because many of the same policies and principles apply as far as access goes to firearms and the lives that we save. And a life lost by suicide is a tragedy in a a huge way, and we need to not change the conversation based on some of those things.
And we know that around 55% of gun deaths in Texas are suicides, and so the numbers really do show us that it's a crisis. Were there bills filed this session, or are you looking toward other pieces of policy or other advocacy efforts to try to reduce firearm suicide?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a huge part of what we know impacts kids directly. And so, and the categories are broad, right? I mean, anything that supports mental health funding, better access for kids. I mean, it's an absolute crisis in our state, in our country right now, as far as mental health access. And, firearms are sort of perpetuating the problem in lots of ways. I would say, the most common impact I see on the kids that I take care of is the secondary trauma, that so many of them are just living in this state of fear, and they're doing lockdown drills, and they're terrified to go to school where school can already be stressful enough for so many kids. And now not only are they worried about their math tests, but they're worried about being murdered. And so, I think so not only kind of acute kids that have suicidal ideation and those sorts of things, but every single kid in our community is impacted by this. And so anything we can do to support mental health of our communities is incredibly valuable and needs to be supported by policy.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. I'm gonna ask Christina another question, and then the group ask some questions of all of you. Christina, can you shed some light on the work of Community Justice Action Fund and advocating for solutions to reduce gun violence for disproportionately impacted communities, and also specifically what pieces of legislation you worked on this session that you thought could help reduce that crisis?
Yeah, definitely. So one of there were a couple of things that we were working on this session, which was trying to establish an Office of Violence Prevention. It didn't go very far. It was not made a priority. We also had a CBI rider that we worked on alongside Texas Gun Sense to try and get $50 million put into the budget for safer, I think it was the Safe Neighborhoods
Project Safe
initiative.
Neighborhood program.
Project Safe Neighborhood.
To make grants available to organizations that are doing community violence intervention work, right?
Yes, which is vitally important. And, that's one of the main focuses that we have, with community justice, is trying to create coalitions and collaboration through CDI organizations to be the boots on the ground, to go into these communities that have been disproportionately affected and lack the resources. Not only lack the resources, but lack the resources to access the resources. And so that's one of the main focuses that community justice has and has been doing. And we're continuing to work on that, from the federal level, trickling it down to the state level, and then bringing it into these communities. Because, very much so, like Lauren was discussing about, what's going on with our children and our young people in our country. We have the same thing with community violence. When these acts of violence are happening in neighborhoods, in parks, at churches, on the street, as children are playing, this trauma, when left untreated, and these families, when they have no resources to be able to move forward, or when that victim is, gets out of the hospital and loses everything, these are the opportunities to be able to break that cycle of violence before it continues. And so that is a lot of the work that that community justice does. And I think that, you know, we're going to continue to work on educating folks on what CBI is, what are credible messengers, and the importance and the important work that they are currently doing in some of our major cities, one being in Travis County. And being able to go in, and when there are these acts of violence, being able to reach out to those community members, reach out to that family, and to make sure that they each individually and as a community have the resources. And when we're talking about making sure that they've got food on their table, making sure that they have access to medical care, mental health care, or just simply support to say, I see you and I hear you. These are ways that we can take that holistic approach to being able to treat the individuals on a human level, because gun violence is becoming a public health crisis. This is becoming, I mean, this gun violence, my daughter even said it. She said, Mom, this is the new coronavirus. And it is. This is something that is just continuing to plague our communities. And, you know, if we have to take the approach legislatively, we have to take the approach not only when it comes to the firearm itself and ensuring that those individuals who are carrying, who are accessing, are those responsible gun owners like myself, like my family. But we also need to ensure that we are treating the people.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Christina. And something that we always say, and I know community justice is a great leader in reminding us of this, is that most cases of gun deaths go under the radar, don't hit national headlines. And those are often in Black and brown communities or due to firearm suicide. You won't hear about them, but they do contribute to the highest numbers of gun deaths. And there are tailored solutions, like making sure that we're funding violence interrupters who are working in hospitals or doing street outreach. And that's why the work of community justice is so important. I want to open up some questions. I'm going to have Mirabelle read out some of the questions that you all have put into the chat. And if you haven't had a chance to submit your question, whether it's related to gun violence prevention work in general or for a particular panelist or about the legislative session specifically, please, this is your chance to enter your questions and have them read out. Mirabelle, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Nicole. I have a question from Terry. So the question goes this way. Is the NRA moving its home office to Richardson, Texas?
I think someone answered it in the chat, actually, and it was Lewis. NRA is looking at Richardson, but no final decision yet. And then he also mentioned that the Texas State Rifle Association is currently located in Bastrop near Austin.
Thank you. And then the second question by Louis. Do you think emphasizing suicide references to firearm mortality and suicide occurrences in active shooting incidents will help influence legislators?
Do we have a panelist that wants to take that up about the question of would emphasizing suicide references to firearm mortality and occurrences in active shooting incidents, would that help influence legislators? With that data, go ahead, Tabby.
I think well, who knows, honestly, but I think that's the approach that I'd like to take next session, to try to talk more. The legislature doesn't enjoy, not that anybody enjoys it, but the legislature really feels uncomfortable about suicide. They really don't like people talking about guns and suicide. There was a lot of pushback when they created the Safe Storage campaign in 2019 from inside the legislature. I had friends who were inside the legislature and knew about it, and there was a lot of pushback on that, because on that website until last year there wasn't anything about suicide. Like, there isn't anything, very little, or it's buried and you have to like dig through a bunch of pages to find it. Other advocates have worked on getting that put together now, and there is more information on the Safe Storage website, but there could be more still. It's still pretty minimal. I was one of the people that said, why don't you use the literature from the Health and Human Services Department, agency about that, and put that on the website instead of linking to some random out-of-date information from out of state. But I think to encourage the conversation, because people are so, it's such a a knee-jerk reaction to shut down if you start talking about gun violence and for people in the legislature. So I think addressing it as a public health crisis, and especially since suicide on its own is a public health crisis, is certainly helpful. And I think that putting more emphasis on firearms suicide would be helpful in the future. But again, I've said this to Nicole since the main session ended. It's also about the advocacy work that we do now through the interim period and the groundwork that we lay now. And one of the things that people don't necessarily understand about the ledge is that most of the offices in the House, at least, are not funded outside of an actual active session. So they can't necessarily support paid staff a lot of the time. Many of the people who were staffing representatives in the ledge over the session were not paid, they were unpaid interns. So please do bring them food. I had to work from home for a while and I was like, nobody's bringing me food anymore. What's up with that? But you know, as a result of that, a lot of staff leave at the end of session because they have to go find jobs that they can make rent. And therefore the aggregate knowledge is not kept in the ledge. So there are people who don't even know necessarily right now what background check laws exist in Texas. There are Republican staffers who told us that we already have background check laws. We don't need a bill on that. And it's like, no, that's really not how it works. So the much shorter version is yes, I think talking about suicide would be more helpful. It might make them uncomfortable to know that middle-aged white men are very high in that percentage of people who are dying by gun suicide in Texas. But emphasizing, I've heard from other people in other states that talking about firearm suicide is a way to get Republicans to listen a little bit more.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Lauren.
Oh, I would just, add to that too. I think from my experience, there has kind of been this dichotomy in the conversation of we don't have a gun problem, we have a mental health problem. And I felt like I heard a lot of conversations this session that kind of challenged that you say there's a mental health problem, here's a bill for that. And I do think we made some movement in some really important mental health policy this session. And I think just continuing to, it's not a and or or it's not a like this or that situation. It's they're both together. Like we have a mental health and a gun problem, and they are so interlocked in every way, and just continuing to reemphasize that. I do think there is such a stigma to the conversation, and I think that plays in. I think things are slowly improving, but just like any other stigma, it takes time, and it takes us repeating these messages over and over again and normalizing the conversation around it.
Thanks for those answers. And parts of what you both said kind of is going to prompt me to another question somebody put in, and I'm just going to open.
Can I just add one last thing to respond as well?
Go ahead.
I was just going to say it's also important when you're getting to that stigma issue, because some people will push back on you talking about gun violence and mental health, but you can turn it and talk about mental illness, which is much more related to gun violence, usually in a self-harm way. So that's when you get back to the suicide point.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you for those points. And thank you, Lewis, for your question. I'm gonna ask this and really open it up to any of the panelists to weigh in. But somebody asked a question earlier about how do the Republican politicians get away with their nonsensical talking points about legislation? And I'll just, I'll say Texas Gun Sense and many of the other organizations we work with, we are nonpartisan organizations, but we also know that the reality is this issue does fall along political lines, and we do hear some pretty divisive, ridiculous rhetoric at the Capitol and in our communities. And so I do want to ask any of our panelists to talk about, how we counter some of that inside the Capitol and or outside of the Capitol.
I'll touch base on a little bit of that. One of the things that was very unique about, how we were able to conduct these conversations at the Capitol is this is no longer a partisan issue with the citizens of Texas. This is no longer, there is no choosing sides for them. And so what we saw a lot of was we had a lot of Republicans. And in fact, here in Santa Fe, our little quartet that is active in the legislature. We have 2 conservative Republicans, 3 gun owners, 2 Democrats, and 1 Army vet. And so there was no way for them to get away with the rhetoric. When they tried to say that, you know, gun laws criminalize responsible gun owners, it was an answer for that. When there was, you know, the rhetoric of, well, Republicans don't support that, our Republicans stood up and said, I do support that. And so I think that in past, what we have seen is we have not had enough of those conservative Republicans coming and speaking out. And I believe that now that they are seeing the writing on the wall, it's a little bit more difficult now for them to get away with it. It's still happening because, of course, we can't go and argue these things on the House floor as our elected officials can do. But there is starting to become a shift. So I say that to give a little bit of hope and a little bit of encouragement, you know, to continue moving forward and continue to be present, and continue to stay engaged. But I truly believe that, you know, to answer the question, it is because no one called them on it. No one called them on their, for lack of a better phrase, BS when they were having these conversations or meeting with advocates.
Thanks, Christina. Anybody else? Quick thoughts? We're at 5:51, and I know we had a couple of things to do before closing. So quick couple minute thoughts on countering some of the really problematic rhetoric inside the building.
Oh, go ahead, Debbie.
I'm sorry. I wanted just to re-emphasize what Representative Goodwin said about reaching out from anywhere in the state to the lieutenant governor and the governor, because they get away with it because they're in power, you know? So there's other things that we can do to change that dynamic, and telling them over and over and over again is one way, but we also need to register voters and change gerrymandering laws and do other things. So, you know, there's plenty of other ways to be advocates in this space, and it's in, you know, listening to other people and getting other people on board.
And yeah, just to agree with the 2 points, but, you know, evidence, science, medicine, kids, these are nonpartisan topics, right? And just going back to the science and what we know is true. I think Christina said that earlier, that we know the truth. This is the truth. And just going back to that and holding fast to that. I have found, you know, the kind of more public, some of the less, I don't know exactly what the I can't remember how it was worded, but nonsensical talking points by anyone, regardless of party. I think the more visibility those comments get, the more people are going to be able to speak out and realize, like, what in the world did this person just say? I know I testified, and I will say I testified on equal parts bills introduced by Republicans and Democrats this session, and so which, you know, take that for whatever you want to take it with, but that was something that in my list of bills that I was able to do this session. But lots of people, I encourage, you know, my friends, family, coworkers, other physicians to watch when I testify, and they get to hear some of those comments, and then, you know, they're calling the representative's office and saying, hey, you said this in the hearing, but here's the science behind it, and here's the evidence. And that's just another voice sort of countering with science, with evidence, with facts, with truth.
Same, Lauren. We also look, there were gun safety bills filed on both by both members of both parties this session. Very unusual, very unprecedented. I've been doing this for 10 years. And when we had the chance to testify in support of any gun safety bill that was filed by a Republican, we did so. So, you know, that in and of itself is maybe showing that we've kind of produced a shift and moved some people even an inch. I'm going to just ask a final question, and then I'm going to close. And my question is, just looking back on the 88th legislative session, on behalf of Representative Goodwin, Christina, and Lauren, what do you consider to be like the most significant, milestone or moment, and how are you going to take you to continue this work into the 2025 legislative session?
I guess I'll go first. I think that the biggest the largest milestone for me was for us to have done the impossible. When I say that 2744 was not supposed to move, that is what was told to these families. And that was not acceptable. For myself and my friends from Santa Fe, this was not our first rodeo. But to see what happened to those families because of the inaction, because our community did not fight hard enough, we feel that guilt. We hold that heaviness in our hearts. To see the passion and to see the drive that happened and occurred with those families, with all of you, to be able to stand and support and drive the calls, we were able to back these lawmakers up against a wall, and they had no choice but to act. And we were able to get it assigned to a committee. We demanded and got it a committee hearing. We were able to get it a vote. That was never supposed to happen. And that is really a new precedent that has been set for the state of Texas. I don't think that sessions moving forward are going to be the same as long as we collectively can keep that same drive and passion to push this change. It was just absolutely incredible. And I know even for my own children, they were just in awe that, oh my God, they finally care. People are finally paying attention to what's happening to us. And so I encourage you all to really, really take that in, that we did something that was never supposed to be possible here in the state of Texas. And other states are starting to get on that and are able to continue that pressure within their respective states. And so that was just an absolutely incredible thing. And to know that these families who are really, really grieving, the love that they feel, and that really drives them to continue. It was just absolutely incredible. So thank you to everyone, who helped to support those families and my own community, because we are making a difference.
Thank you. Lauren, Tabby,
I-
real quick, 1 minute if you have it.
I can go quick. I would say, I think the most significant moment for me is I was in the hearing room that night when the Uvalde survivors testified, and I testified after they had finished. It was like 1 a.m. by the time they were done, and I walked out of that room a different person, and I think everyone in that room did, and I think every legislator walked out of that room a different person, even regardless of how they voted. And I think that can't be understated. And I think things, it's just hard to quantify what happened in that room. And even though we didn't ultimately get to the end of where we were trying to get this session, I think that we will never go back to where we were before that happened. And I think that's so important to remember. And I think the going forward and the takeaway, people ask me all the time, what is the most effective thing I can do to be an advocate? And I say kind of the most effective advocacy action that you can take is the one that you are willing to do and the one that you'll actually do. And so, every single thing counts. But if you don't do it, it doesn't count. And so, whatever that looks like for you in this moment, in that day, whether that's showing up and testifying, whether that's donating to Texas Gun Sense, where, Nicole and everyone on Nicole's team is relentlessly fighting for all of our lives. The most effective advocacy is the advocacy that we actually do.
Thank you. Tabby, what do you think Representative Goodwin would want us to know about that?
I think she would say that we did make some progress. She did at the beginning of the conversation. So I think it was a big she just really appreciates all the advocacy that you guys did for us and how much you supported us. And I get verklempt, but really touched and moved by how many families we had in the office and how many people wanted to come to us as a safe space. And Rhonda has great cookies. And for me, having the Cazares family from Uvalde stay in the committee hearing until nearly 4 o'clock in the morning to support us, even though everyone had done their testifying for their bills. But staying and listening through our bills because we didn't get our background check and waiting period bills listened to until like 3 in the morning. Having the one family from Uvalde with Christina stay until our bills had been heard was really so moving to me, and I will always be very grateful to them for that. So I'm just going to burst into tears now. That's how it is.
That's how we do it.
It was a very difficult session, and we appreciated all of your support.
And thanks for using the word verklempt. I just love that. I'm gonna close real quick, and I know we're at 6 o'clock, and I'm gonna leave you with this. I wanted to have our panelists be the focus, but I will also say that we did not walk out of the session without successes. Please read our legislative report that was linked, because what you will see in there is we drove thousands and thousands of calls and emails, and we had a major safe gun storage win that you probably won't hear about. It wasn't in the form of a piece of legislation. It was initially a piece of legislation that wasn't going to make it further than a hearing. It was never going to get a committee vote. We saw that. So we were able to quickly hustle to have that piece of legislation be added as an amendment to HB 3, a school safety bill that passed this session. And what that amendment will do is make sure that every school district in the state of Texas is providing information about safe gun storage to parents of all K through 12 school children in the state of Texas. This is huge. And it's not going to get a lot of attention in the media, but it's in our legislative report. I hope you'll read that. And I just hope that you'll remember that that small wins are big wins. And by the way, I don't really consider that a small win. I consider it a major success. We've been working for many, many years to make sure that parents know that simply storing a gun safely in a locked container or a safe with ammunition separated can prevent unintentional shootings, suicides, and other tragedies, including like what happened at Santa Fe High School when a 17-year-old accessed his father's rifle and killed 10 people and injured 13. Am I right on the numbers, Christina? Anyway, I want you to know work is being done, and we are here to lead that work with our panelists, with all of you, with the rest of our coalition members and the public, and we'll just continue. We're absolutely going to just keep going. Mirabelle earlier put into the chat our donate link. If you can just, $10, $20, $25, that makes a difference in helping a small organization like ours continue to provide this education to you, continue to lead our coalition, and continue to be a strong, steady presence at the Capitol, at city halls, and in our communities. So please, I encourage you to make a donation and continue to stay engaged and involved. If you have follow-up questions after this, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can send emails to us at info@txgunsense.org. And we would love to get back to you. Make sure you're on our newsletter so that you can get our updates. And I'm going to just thank our panelists so very much for their time, and my staff for putting this on, and all of you for spending the evening with us. And thank you for caring about this issue. Appreciate you. Have a good night.